When we think of the Middle Ages, most of us picture mist-covered fields, ancient stone castles, or gallant knights in gleaming armor. But behind that epic and romanticized image lies another, lesser-known reality: the emergence of urban centers that were gradually reshaping life across Europe. Though they never reached the size of modern megacities, medieval towns and cities boasted an astonishing level of social and administrative complexity, with systems of governance, schools, banks, lawyers, hospitals, bustling marketplaces, and monumental cathedrals that, in many cases, still stand to this day. And yet, despite such structure, even the people who lived during that time weren't entirely convinced that life within city walls was something to aspire to. In fact, anything vile or wicked that could exist in the world could often be found in those very cities. Medieval urban life wasn't necessarily a beacon of civilization, but rather a gathering place for every kind of sin and depravity the human mind could conjure. So what was the truth? Let us turn back the clock and uncover the hidden realities of life inside the cities of the medieval world in today's video. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. The rise of urban centers. For centuries during the early Middle Ages, the lives of most Europeans were deeply rooted in the countryside, among farmlands, tiny villages, and the vast web of feudal estates that stretched across the continent. Before the 11th century, it is estimated that up to 90% of the population lived in rural environments, where an individual's existence was almost entirely bound to the land and to customs that had been passed down through generations. But then, as trade routes expanded and Europe's economy slowly recovered from the long, shadowy aftermath of the Roman collapse, new opportunities for commerce began to emerge, often in places few had previously considered: roadside junctions, open grounds near monasteries, castles, or river ports. These locations, once little more than temporary rest stops, began to attract craftsmen, merchants, traders, and even serfs longing to escape the bonds of feudal life. Villages gradually grew into towns, and towns into cities, enclosed by towering stone walls, fortified with guard towers and arrow slits, and accessible only through heavily guarded gates. Unlike the countryside, where one's role in life was typically fixed at birth, these fledgling cities offered something different. Here, people could alter their fate through labor, trade, and skill. Urban populations were a mosaic of backgrounds. Some were born free, but many were runaway serfs seeking liberation from servitude. And so, in the heart of feudal Europe, a new way of life began to take shape: the freedom and laws governing serfs. In the feudal system of the Middle Ages, a person's station in life was not determined by talent or hard work, but by the place of their birth. For those born into serfdom, life was confined within a strict and unforgiving framework. They were tied to a parcel of land owned by a lord, and were required to work it in exchange for the right to cultivate a small portion to feed their families. They were forbidden from leaving the estate, could not marry without permission, and had no right to choose their own future. And yet, even within such a seemingly inescapable system, there remained a narrow path open to those who were bold and yearned for freedom. According to an unwritten but widely accepted rule across many European cities, a serf could become a free person if they managed to escape from their lord's estate and live in a city for 1 year and 1 day without being captured. Once that threshold had passed, no one, no matter how powerful, had the legal authority to force them back into servitude. But of course, this was far from easy. A fugitive serf could not risk revealing their identity. Registering their name in the city's official ledger was tantamount to sending a personal invitation for the estate's authorities to come and seize them. For this reason, many cities developed informal lists, underground rosters, of runaway serfs. These individuals often hid in narrow alleys, quietly waiting out the days until freedom. Some city officials, keenly aware of how essential labor was for urban growth, actively supported this practice. In certain cases, estate managers were even bribed by city administrators to encourage serfs to abandon the fields and move into the towns. The scale of medieval cities. When we think of cities in the modern world, names like New York, Tokyo, or Delhi instantly come to mind. Towering skyscrapers, sprawling transit systems, and millions of people packed into every square mile. But if we turn back the clock to the Middle Ages, the very concept of a large city looked entirely different. By today's standards, medieval cities were remarkably modest in size. Throughout the 13th century, even the most developed urban centers would scarcely reach the size of a modern-day town. London, the beating heart of the English kingdom at the time, was believed to be home to roughly 80,000 to 100,000 residents prior to the Black Death in 1348. Compared to the vast metropolises of today, that number is equivalent to a large residential neighborhood. And yet, in its era, London stood as a towering giant in the medieval urban world. Farther north, the cities of York and Bristol, the second and third largest in England around the year 1300, housed only about 10,000 to 12,000 inhabitants each, less than a single block in Manhattan today. Across continental Europe, the situation was not much different. Bruges and Ghent, two bustling trading cities in the Flanders region of what is now Belgium, also reached populations of around 40,000 to 50,000, roughly on par with London around the year 1100. And if we expand our scope to all of Europe, by the 13th century, only about 15 to 20 cities had populations exceeding 25,000. This scarcity made large cities a dream destination for runaway serfs, those who yearned for freedom and the promise of a different life. Trade and commercial relations. If medieval cities were places where people sought freedom and opportunity, then commerce was the lifeblood that sustained them. Among the cities that stood at the heart of the medieval trade network, London, Bruges, and Ghent emerged as three critical links, connecting both shores of the North Sea and fueling an economy still in its formative stages. The rise of these three cities was no accident. It was the result of a steady, ongoing exchange of goods, chief among them wool and textiles. From the lush green pastures of the English countryside, raw wool was sheared from millions of sheep, then gathered and transported to London. There, it was sorted, packed into bales, and brought to the docks along the River Thames. At the port, the goods were loaded onto ships, which followed the tide southeastward across the English Channel, eventually arriving at Bruges or Ghent, home to some of the most skilled weavers in all of medieval Europe. Upon reaching the shores of what is now Belgium, the raw wool entered the weaving workshops. In these workshops, under the meticulous care of craftsmen, it was transformed into fine textiles and later cut and sewn into cloaks, gowns, and garments worn by nobles and merchants alike. Part of this finished cloth would then fan out across the continent, reaching the wealthy elite from Paris to Venice. The rest would make its way back to England, completing a cycle that bound these cities together. The trade relationship among London, Bruges, and Ghent was not merely economic cooperation. It was a vivid symbol of a Europe slowly rising again. Perhaps for this reason, by the 12th century, the populations of all three cities were roughly comparable. Not only merchants, but also laborers, immigrants, and artisans flocked to them in search of a chance to change their fate. Filth and disease. Beneath the vibrant exterior of medieval cities lay a darker, often overlooked reality. If trade was the force driving urban growth, then the absence of even the most basic sanitation was the shadow that followed closely behind. In a world still unaware of germs and epidemiology, cities became the perfect breeding grounds for disease and contagion. Narrow, crowded streets, paved in cobblestones or hard-packed earth, were routinely flooded with mud, livestock droppings, animal carcasses, and human waste. With no underground sewage systems like those we take for granted today, residents would routinely dump dirty water, urine, or even feces straight from upper-story windows into the streets below. It was a dangerous tradition that pedestrians had to learn to avoid instinctively, an act of survival. By 1371, however, the authorities in London were forced to confront the issue. New ordinances were issued forbidding the dumping of waste out of windows and requiring households to carry their dirty water down to the street and pour it into drainage channels that lined the roads. Anyone caught violating this law would be fined 2 shillings, a significant amount for the average citizen, for each instance of carelessly dumping waste onto unsuspecting passers-by. This marked not only the beginning of an effort to improve public hygiene, but also a growing awareness in medieval society of the link between living conditions and communal health. In other cities such as Coventry and York, the regulations were even stricter. Residents were required to sweep the area in front of their homes at least once a week, usually on Saturdays. Failure to do so could result in a fine of up to 12 pence, enough to make anyone reconsider their daily habits. As part of this growing wave of sanitation reform, London introduced its first municipal garbage collection system in 1372, a remarkable advancement in urban management for the time. Using 24 horses and 12 carts, the city began organizing weekly garbage pickups, transporting waste outside the city walls for disposal. Cities like York, Norwich, and Coventry soon followed suit. Though crude and far from a complete solution, this system represented a meaningful attempt to bring order to public life in an age still lacking in modern infrastructure. And yet, despite new laws and reforms, reality remained difficult to manage. Every day, hundreds of newcomers from the countryside poured into the cities, bringing with them not just goods, but also dogs, horses, pigs, chickens, and with them, filth, refuse, and disease. It was a flood of humanity that quickly overwhelmed even the best efforts of the city's street cleaners. Violence and punishment. Medieval cities were not only centers of religious life and trade, they were also hotbeds of conflict, where clashes and disputes often ended in bloodshed. As more and more people crowded into confined urban spaces, the tendency toward violence grew stronger. By the late 14th century, rates of serious crime had surged, ranging from theft and assault to outright murder. But what was even more striking than the number of these incidents was the trivial nature of their causes. A petty argument, an unintended slight, or even something as mundane as a misplaced pile of garbage could cost someone their life. One particularly notable case occurred in 1326, when Johann Tully was thrown to the ground and killed after urinating from an upper-story window late at night. In another case, Roger Styward, an eel vendor from Hampton, was chased down and beaten to death for dumping rotten eel skins in front of someone else's shop. No one can say exactly how many times William Emery, a poultry seller in London, had been reported by his neighbors for tossing dead birds and horse manure into the street. On one occasion, he even dumped a vat of horse urine, fermented for weeks, into the middle of the road, creating a stench so foul that no one dared pass. His story ended when a neighbor took justice into their own hands and killed him. Amid this growing chaos, the City of London introduced a special policy in 1414. Anyone who reported illegal dumping would receive a reward of 2 shillings and 4 pence, equivalent to nearly £100 in today's currency. In addition to that reward, the informant would also receive an extra 12 pence, drawn directly from the fine paid by the offender. This policy significantly curbed the act of illegal dumping, and, in turn, helped reduce the violence that so often stemmed from these seemingly minor transgressions. Urban economy and culture. Each morning, from distant countryside hamlets, farmers, hunters, herders, and small-scale traders made their way into the city, bringing with them chickens, pigs, milk, animal hides, flour, and herbs. They came not only to sell, but also to buy or barter for essentials such as forged knives, pottery, cloth, wine, and news. It was this constant, cyclical exchange that created an interdependent economic ecosystem. Within the city walls, the urban social structure was clearly stratified, reflecting not only economic power, but also political and cultural influence. At the top stood the landowning elite, individuals who held property and occupied key seats on the city council. Alongside them were prominent merchants and lawyers, who helped transform the city into a center of commerce and legal authority. Beneath them was a rapidly growing middle class composed of skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, jewelers, as well as small merchants who worked in market stalls. These individuals often lived and worked in shopfront homes, where the ground floor served as a storefront or workshop, while the family resided on the floors above. This mixed-use model of production and living remains visible in many European cities to this day. And finally, at the base of the urban pyramid were the unskilled laborers, porters, cleaners, livestock handlers, and hired hands. But perhaps one of the most vivid and lasting reflections of the medieval urban economy and culture still exists today, etched into the very street signs. Walk through the historic quarters of London, York, or Norwich, and you'll encounter names like Pie Corner, Beef Lane, Apothecary Street, and Fisher Row. These are not random designations, but historical markers of once specialized neighborhoods, places for selling pies, slaughtering cattle, preparing medicines, and gathering fishermen. The church and religious authority. To the people of the time, the church was a spiritual center, an economic engine, and an enduring architectural symbol. In the medieval world, religion was not merely a belief system, it was a structure of total dominion over every aspect of life. From birth to death, from business transactions to the enforcement of laws, the presence of the church was constant and unshakable. Cathedrals and great basilicas were not only places of worship, they were embodiments of divine authority and humanity's yearning for transcendent beauty. Take, for instance, York Minster, one of medieval England's greatest points of pride. Construction began in the year 627, but it would take nearly 850 years to complete, finally reaching its full form in 1472. Across generations of kings through wars and political upheavals, York Minster continued to rise, restored, expanded, and elevated, like an oath passed down through the centuries, that faith should be etched into stone and stained glass for all time. Or consider Cologne Cathedral in Germany, whose foundations were laid in 1248. A masterpiece of Gothic architecture, its towering columns seemed to pierce the very heavens. It would not near completion until the mid-16th century, after generations of craftsmen poured their skill, and at times, even their lives, into erecting this extraordinary symbol of human creativity. But these monumental structures did not come into existence by chance. They sustained an entire artisan economy, employing stonemasons, sculptors, carpenters, stained glass artists, architects, and bellcasters. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, found work through the construction of these churches, and their function extended far beyond worship. Churches were centers of festivals, education, charity, and even finance. Many of the great cathedrals owned vast lands, collected taxes, and managed the city's earliest hospitals and schools. In an era when the secular state had yet to fully emerge, the church effectively was the state. It wielded greater power than lords, held more wealth than merchants, and no one dared to defy it in public. A contrasting perspective, den of sin or hub of delight. From a distance, a medieval city could appear enchanting, with its towering bell towers, sturdy stone walls, and the lively hum of colorful markets. But stepping inside, one would find a far more complex world, one that both inspired and unsettled in equal measure. In the 1190s, Richard Devizes, a monk and renowned chronicler, described London as a vast den of sin. To him, the city was not a place where men turned their eyes toward spiritual light, but a snare brimming with temptations, taverns, gambling dens, and brothels, all of which, he believed, were signs of moral decay festering in the very shadow of the church. Yet only a few decades later, another voice offered a dramatically different view. William FitzSteven, a cleric and secretary to Archbishop Thomas Becket, painted London as a place of thrilling festivals, spirited amusements, and profound piety. In his eyes, the city was not only a center of commerce and religion, but also a playground for the soul and body alike. He described young men gliding across the frozen Thames in winter and kicking balls in summer, activities that brought vitality and community to the city's inhabitants. To FitzSteven, London was not a symbol of corruption, but proof of human richness and diversity. So who was right? Perhaps both were, and neither. For like any great city today, from New York to Paris, medieval cities carried within them an unshakable duality. On the same street, one might hear church bells ringing alongside the shouting of merchants and the laughter of children chasing each other. On the same day, one could witness a solemn religious procession, followed shortly by a tavern brawl over unpaid ale. This was not contradiction. It was the human condition, laid bare within the tight, energetic quarters of the city. The truth is, medieval cities were not so different from the urban centers we live in today. They were not just places for business, prayer, or pleasure. They were homes to dreams, temptations, failures, and hope. And just like today, what you see in a city often depends on the lens through which you choose to look. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this journey through the cities of the medieval world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next video. We'll see you again in the next episode.